time. Thank you very much for the introduction, but much more to the point, thank you very much for the invitation. And I take this as an important acknowledgement of my work, actually. So I would say that your invitation counts as a significant other in this process of negotiating what one has to say in academia. And I decided to write down my ideas, partly to make sure that I will get everything within the time frame I am given, but also to make sure that this can be recorded. Because if I just starting off the cuff, okay, I might not be as focused. And I think if you want to pass this on, it's important to have like thought through statements. And before I start the talk as well, what I would like you to understand is back in 2000 at the University of Lancaster, when I earned my PhD in social linguistics, that's the bastion of critical discourse analysis. That is earned from a faculty of social sciences, not a faculty of philology or humanities, although my two MAs prior to that come from there. So I don't really belong neither here nor there, and that actually is a productive rupture in many ways. Now, to make sure that you are with me, because you are not necessarily into engaging with social events, social conflicts, identities, political events, you name it, from the angle of signification, I thought like at the beginning, I would locate you within the epistemological model, within the framework I work with. Then I would want to situate you in the context of the order of discourse of hate speech in contemporary Hungarian political communication, and then focus on the 4 particular legislative events, okay, that I understand to be evolving around discrediting in different senses of the term gender. And at the end, I would like to propose a way out of the affect of hate in the direction of trust, and like what I mean by trust. So in other words, I wouldn't like to finish on the meager horizon of contemporary right-wing political discourse in the country, but how it could be stepped by or gone beyond. Okay, so thanks for your attention. So I'm arguing tonight that over the past decade or so, a ubiquitous discourse of hate propaganda has been established as routine, banal mode of communication in contemporary political discourse in Hungary. I identified the beginning of this period in 2010, when the Fidesz Christian Democrats coalition, under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, first came into power and maintained a supermajority in parliament 4 times to date. This rhetoric of stigmatization mobilizes fear to legitimize the affect of hate towards whatever it is associated with or explicitly said to be a threat. This is a major instrument in the regime's so-called cultural war that aims to replace the Hungarian cultural and academic elite and restructure their institutions into ones loyal to the regime. The very term of cultural war was introduced by the Prime Minister's usual speech delivered at the so-called Summer University in Tusványos, Romania, back in 2018, observing his tradition of outlining the major agenda of the government for the upcoming period of the regime in these summer schools. Now, let me elaborate a little bit about the framework, i.e. doing critical studies of discourse. Above all, I would like to clarify some of the key tenets in the framework of critical analysis of discourse, with a focus on all three terms in its naming. First of all, I would like to establish that the category of discourse is not developed in linguistics. It's not a category of language that should conveniently be reduced to language or text. The concept, i.e. discourse, is transdisciplinary and cannot be automatically adopted for the purpose of linguistic analysis. It was introduced, I suppose we all know, by Michel Foucault in his monograph, The Archaeology of Knowledge, published in English in 1972, which is his criticism of then contemporary linguistics and history for their empiricist understanding of the relationship between reality and language, or reality and knowledge, as well as between the mind and concepts and words, where the first element of the binary is seen to be a natural source or cause of knowledge and meaning, respectively. Foucault takes issue with the referential relationship between the two elements, according to which our statements should be literally consequential upon what there is in the world, and the corresponding knowledge concepts of that reality should be represented in our categories and words, truthfully or not. Instead of this structuralist position, he argues for an intertwined, mutually constitutive relationship between the two, interrupting the fractal logic that should automatically generate further nestings of the same binary of immediate constituency on either side of the divide. The fractal logic of mathematics at work was first introduced by Susan Gall and Gail Kligman's book entitled The Politics of Gender After State Socialism, published in 2000, in which they bring along the example of the understanding, the conceptualization of the public-private distinction. In their formulation, and I quote them, whatever the local, historically specific content of the dichotomy, the distinction between public and private can be reproduced repeatedly by projecting it onto narrower contexts or broader ones. Or it can be projected onto different social objects, i.e. activities, identities, institutions, spaces, and interactions that can be further categorized into private and public parts. Then, through recursivity and recalibration, each of these parts can be recategorized again by the same public-private distinction. It is crucial that such calibrations are always relative positions and not properties laminated onto the persons, objects, or spaces concerned. They are like Bachtian voicings or perspectives rather than fixed categories. The term fractal is used in geometry to describe how a single pattern recurs inside itself, is self-similar, often with multiple meanings. End of quote. That is, the public and private are co-constitutive cultural categories, and they are indexical signs that are always relative, dependent for part of their referential meaning on the interactional context in which they are used. In other words, their meaning is necessarily intertextual, echoing and resonating with their multiple uses, past, actual, and potential. Once categories are established, they can be used to characterize, categorize, organize, and contrast spaces, institutions, bodies, groups, activities, interactions, relations, etc. James Paul Gee, another contemporary critical linguist, would capture this co-constitutive, intertwined relationship of the text-context nexus, i.e. of discourse, as language in action with hyphenation, where language use is constitutive of what we understand to be the case of the world in a historically specific situation, and that situation in turn is to shape how we may articulate, encode what we have to say, depending on the power dynamic organizing the activities we are engaged in performing. This also implies that we as speakers are always already caught within socially regulated collective practices at the intersection of multiple ways of enacting the world, including multiple practices of signification. So we are not outside of the events. The paradigm entails two major tenets relevant for my analysis. One is that whatever we recognize as meaningful in an event of communication is situated, that is, embedded within a particular matrix of differential relations of power. Consequently, the meaning of a concept is organized out of multiple elements into a more or less coherent pattern where the elements necessarily pull in different directions. The other is that meaning is emergent, is the result of ongoing negotiations, indexical of the institutional organization of social life. As Deborah Cameron, in Language and Sexual Politics, published in 2009, has argued, language is not a neutral means of transfer of ideas from one mind to another, which she calls telementation, but it is contextualized and therefore a site for power struggle over whose meaning is to become obvious. It is in this sense that we can talk about the politics of the meaning of sexuality, migration, gender, peace, or any other concept. When we are researching language use, our ultimate aim is to explore the ideological investments of meaning, that is to see if the meaning of a given category reiterates unequal relations of participants as if given and beyond change. However, according to the referential paradigm of meaning, the objective to change language use for trying to shape a less exclusionary, more egalitarian world does not make sense. What needs to be changed according to that paradigm is not language use, but the world out there, outside of academia and outside of the language of our publications. Any scientific project that sees speech as performative or constitutive is routinely dismissed in contemporary right-wing populist discourse as an act of wokeism or PC, or as biased subjective ideology or belief in conservative academic discourse that would defend objective, value-free descriptions of our academic observations of the world as it is. In opposition to this stance, in an act of critique in critical discourse analysis for a shorthand CDA, we are to pursue the impact of institutional organization of life on the meaning of a category. Our analysis is to explore for what reasons, how, with what consequences, what kind of discourse positions are articulated for whom to assume, what activities with what consequences are enabled from within those positions. The validity criteria of such analysis are both internal and external. Internal validity entails the coherence, the explanatory power of the arguments developed. External validity entails the explanatory power of the researcher's decisions about what textually mediated events, histories, cultural practices, global changes should be brought in when the researcher builds the interpretative context around the topic that is singled out as the focus of their analytical attention. In the course of our critical analysis, we make use of the multiple elements that are integral to the meaning of a category. It is this multiplicity each category is organized out of that may allow us to expose the unsaid but assumed statements and the consequences of their common sense status for the material life of particular members of a speech community. Secondly, meaning is multiple also in the sense that each constituent element in a pattern is intertwined into several other coherent patterns, decentering the semiotic field. Therefore, there is always a limit to what can be exposed and what remains invisible, but we do have the possibility of shifting our critical gaze along the vector of a given constituent element and move in the direction of another configuration of an other pattern. This is what I understand by critique, this shift enabled by the ruptures brought about by multiplicity. The ultimate research question is to pursue if a given meaning, addressed from a particular perspective, reiterates the dominant relations of power as given and as such unchangeable, and to trace down the reasons for which it is argued to be the case. In short, the discourse analysis is a reflexive critique and not a descriptive account of what there is. Shifting our perspective along the vector of any of the constituent elements allows for the assumption of a different position from where it is made possible to reflect on our previous location. Trying to give an exact account what we have observed, in fact, means to reiterate, to stay within the perspective of the discourse under investigation. The difference between the two positions can be grasped by James Paul G's claim that to be recognized as member of a speech community, as one of us, entails to be sufficiently in sync with the given routine practices of communication. From this, what follows for me is to say that critique then is an act of subverting the limit of this sufficiency. We come to disidentify with the conditions of being recognized as one of us, including, of course, doing linguistics according to the canonized logic or not. At the same time, let me underscore that we must be always open to the possibility of making a mistake, precisely because within this model, there is no promise of complete foreseeability of a God's perspective, to use Donna Haraway's ironic metaphor. Now, after this, I'm moving on to the data and the analysis. And in the first place, I would like to build the interpretative context for my analysis of the rhetoric of hate through the 4 legislative acts during the COVID period. So the second term of the current regime from 2014 to 2018 included the billboard campaign against the refugees in 2015, the so-called Lex CEU, and the appropriation of the academic research institutes in 2017, and finally, the revoking of the MA in gender studies in 2018. So I singled out 4 events in 3 years. They functioned as discursive sites for solidifying the order of hate speech. The regime's propaganda effectively stigmatized several categories of identity as empty signifiers in Ernesto Lachlan's sense of the term, developed in his book Populist Reason, published in 1996. The 4 tropes of hate over these 4 years are the intellectuals, genderists or lobbyists, Soros interchanging with Brussels, and migrants. The signifiers are empty in the sense that their meaning is intensely reworked to emerge as the exact opposite of their conventional intelligibility, to become decontextualized, detached from their established context, to the point where each can routinely implicate the others without actual mention through a chain of equivalences that govern their new associations. Okay. The discourse strategy of free interchangeability draws on a systematic naturalization of the contradictory relationships across the 4 tropes, so that they all may naturally share and evoke the meaning of threat for us, underscoring an absolute demarcation line between the hostile enemy, them, and us, the homogenized collective of some imaginary unity of the nation. Okay. How does the logic of the hate rhetoric work? Now, to demonstrate that, I would like to attend, okay, to the ban of the MA degree in gender studies back in 2018, and through the analysis, I would like to demonstrate how the different tropes are invoked, okay, according to the logic of that hate rhetoric. So, the choice of gender studies over other disciplinary fields for a spectacular public execution, in my opinion, is not an arbitrary but a calculated decision. The official justification of the ban indirectly legitimizes the decision by contending that the government has not revoked a discipline, but an ideology. Redefining the meaning of gender, the key analytical category of feminist scholarship, as mere ideology, was expected to come across as convincing for the general public more easily than any key category of analysis in other social science disciplines. First of all, the category of gender entered the public discourse relatively late, in the wake of the system change in 1989. Furthermore, from the very beginning, it was predominantly brought up in public discussions, if at all, only to be discredited as an ideology. Most importantly, on the horizon of its common sense, the label of ideology by itself entails serving party political interests. That meaning is difficult to challenge in a country like Hungary, whose academic institutions only 2 decades before suffered constant interference from the one-party state before the system change. After 1989, countering their lived experience, researchers wished to secure their autonomy by appealing to the objectivity of science. However, the claim to neutrality is counter-effective in that it prevents the researchers from seeing that to be recognized as scientific means to be positioned as powerful. Such recognition entails contestations of the dominant terms of evaluation. Finally, gender studies, unlike many other disciplines, has always been explicit about its politics of knowledge, about its objective to undermine the regime's authoritarian power that is grounded in an extremely conservative, misogynistic gender order, one that is the dominant organization of life in Hungary. When the discipline of gender studies is denied academic merit and relegated into the domain of party political ideology, the argument firstly mobilizes the regime's populist discourse against anything intellectual, which is defined as the other of the value of productivity. The latter dichotomy will further associate gender studies and by extension any critical social research with the meaning of sophistry of words. Once labeled to be an ideology, the sophistry is associated with the meaning of deceptive words that are not only useless, but an act of dangerous mind washing in comparison with real science that, through this binary opposition, also comes to be implicated to be real because productive, i.e. material in its application. See the promotion of applied sciences over theoretical approaches in the country at the same time. Whenever the government wants to reinforce its credibility in regard of education and research policies, they mobilize this right-wing populist discourse against anything intellectual for its allegedly non-productive paradise, even parasite, even frivolous nature, while elevating and fetishizing productivity in the name of utility and realpolitik. The second narrative that has framed the fate of the MA degree in gender studies implicates the institutional origin of gender studies at the Central European University in Budapest. The institution is routinely labeled as the Soros University in the government's official statements. This hostile stigmatization is based on the fact that George Soros, the philanthrope of Hungarian Jewish descent, was the founder of CEU in 1991. I argue the discipline's affiliation with CEU meant that the new Hungarian program at the Eötvös Loránd University Budapest could stand no chance. In October 2018, when the MA degree was banned, CEU was already under siege by the government. The newly fabricated law on so-called foreign branch campuses was passed in April 2017. Chartered in New York State, CEU was now demanded retroactively to have an actual teaching campus in the US to be allowed to run study programs in Hungary. It was effectively targeting CEU, the only institution, private institution, without such a campus out of the 7 private universities in the country at the moment of the new bill. The law eventually forced CEU out of the country, making the Hungarian higher education system safe from its so-called liberal propaganda. Secondly, the alleged threat of the Soros University inevitably implicates the gender studies degree the university issues as the instrument of liberal propaganda of Soros. Gender studies may be showcased as evidence for the government to legitimize their 2-year vendetta against CEU, which, though through a further move of association, could also test the Hungarian academic community's resistance to such abuse of academic autonomy. If the decision to close gender studies at ELTE in the very year did not meet any resistance, it is even more upsetting to understand that because in 2018, it was running its first academic year and all the allegations about wasting the national budget, or as a degree that did not meet any demand, just simply could not stand up that 1 year history. Okay, could not stand up to that 1 year history. And in actual fact, if it were only a concern about wasting the national budget, then the MA could have been kept as a fee-paying program, but it was not allowed to exist even in that form. Okay. To make its infamous illiberal democracy project work, the Orbán regime and its think tanks have singled out George Soros on 2 intertwined accounts. Firstly, he was attacked as representative of Western liberalism that is further associated with Brussels, i.e. the European Union. The original mission of the university to promote liberal democracy in the wake of the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe is redefined in the 2010s to mean the enemy of the current regime. It is to index everything Orbán's authoritarian illiberal regime has set out to destroy, partly for the sake of the so-called reorientation of the country's foreign policy towards the East. From this perspective, CEU's mere existence and objective to promote an open society, whatever that should mean, may expose the government's broader agenda. From this perspective, CEU is indeed a threat, but that critical meaning must be reversed. Secondly, the government harnessed a long tradition of anti-Semitism in the country when denouncing George Soros as the ultimate hideous financial power behind an illiberal mission. Soros's descent of Hungarian Jewish family made him the ideal target and construct the Soros trope to mean the enemy within. Through a systemic vilification, the mention of the Soros figure automatically renders the meaning of CEU and its degrees into the site of hideous ideological conspiracy that has gender studies as its secret weapon. Consequently, runs the logic of the official propaganda, it's only right for the government to purge our academia and protect its scientific autonomy from such ideological interventions. The Soros trope works not only to mean the enemy within, though, it means at the same time the enemy outside. That external location emerged in the Hungarian government's official propaganda in the context of the refugee crisis Europe encountered in 2015. The despicable propaganda that redefines the meaning of refugee as opportunistic migrant takes me to the third narrative frame, which defines the concept of gender and its study as an alien ideology. The image of the frightful, ghastly, monstrous Jew became ubiquitous since the summer of 2015, when the government began to set up huge billboards all over the country as part of their anti-refugee campaigns. His figure is neatly paired with the figure of the refugee in the xenophobic and anti-Islamic discourse in the Did You Know series of blue billboards. The Soros trope as an enemy from outside is accused of plotting the Islamization of a Christian Europe, inviting the citizenry to unite and feel justified in their fear and hate against the forced migration of people through the Balkan route. To sum up, the association of gender studies with liberalism and the private institution of CEU made the targeting of the program symbolic of the much broader agenda of the Hungarian regime against the European Union and the country's allies of neoliberal democracies in the West, which has been termed by the Prime Minister as illiberal democracy. can read actually a very fascinating discussion about that by an article published by Gábor Polyák back in 2019. Gender studies as a discipline came indirectly to mean and embody all imaginable values that were perceived to undermine the myth of Hungary as the self-styled protecting shield of the old Christian Europe, the true Europe, who protects its citizens against the danger of Brussels and the non-Christian Muslim migrant in alliance with the hostile EU bureaucrats who are not productive, with no national mandate, and as such, with no performance of real productivity. The mere mention of the trope of Soros, gender or intellectual, can function as the center of multiple, often contradictory discourses of fear. These names have become an empty signifier in Laclau's sense of the term. Whichever figure is mentioned, its meaning is automatically articulated out of the other two or three, each with their complex chains of association without actual mention. In my understanding, right-wing populist discourses of fear produce social relations across empty signifiers set up as if in a non-reconcilable antagonistic conflict through the routine use of diverse forms of hate speech. The exclusionary logic produces a nexus between equally unspecified positions in a dire opposition to us, an equally vague kind of populace. In the homogenized us, the diverse social groups are offered the opportunity to recognize themselves as if the same, downplaying the fact that they live their lives to different degrees in fear of precarity, of losing their autonomy, of lacking the possibility of transparent political institutions. They can conveniently be called upon to come together and reimagine themselves as we, who are strong defenders of any values the nation should stand for in the face of an event, institution, or collective declared to be a hostile, malicious threat against us. Just as importantly, it's also an exceptionally useful ideological rhetorical move for the government in that the mentioning of the trope will safely prevent us, the actual citizens addressed, from acknowledging that our sense of fairness and legitimacy disadvantages various others, such as refugees, civil organizations helping them, or educational and cultural institutions who try to build alliances of solidarity. Most importantly, the chain of equivalences organizing the hate rhetoric will save us from seeing that the most powerful actor in building entitlements and privileges on our backs is the government itself. Now, is there a way out of the government's gender craze? What is at stake in understanding how this rhetoric of hate works? I would argue it's not simply the usual concern for a CDA analysis, namely exposing the rhetoric in the regime's political communication. It is much more important to understand that what is at stake in making the hate rhetoric itself banal is that even positions contesting the regime's communicative strategies are easily caught within the same logic. So it is not going to produce a government versus opposition distinction. It has become a routine that mobilizes our understandings of who we and various groups of others are in relation to us. In short, we are inevitably caught within a community of practice of hate. This is precisely the case when, for instance, contemporary voices who self-identify in opposition with the official propaganda reiterates and mobilizes the dominant rhetoric of hate, even if the target singled out is those in power. A particularly painful example of this reiteration of the right-wing discourse is the critique voiced by feminists who self-identify as progressive when they target other feminists who, in their understanding, are not real feminists because they are apparently compromised by state power when they reduce the political struggle against structural inequalities of gender to a matter of mere recognition in the eyes of the law. These improper feminists are singled out as the enemy of feminism from within for using the category of gender in a misleading way. They are called the queer feminists, who would argue for gender to be a verb, a socially regulated practice of sexuality. And that is their sin. This is wrong because it challenges the biological givenness of sexual difference into male-female that should have a corresponding set of gender roles attached to them respectively. The progressive feminist logic tries to challenge the government's propaganda and its systemic stigmatization of gender as dangerous ideology. But they try to reclaim the category of feminist critique, that is to expose the naturalization of patriarchal relations of power by differentiating in terms of a binary between material versus symbolic disadvantages or harms. However, in their interpretation, the queer feminist position undermines the right, read, biologized meaning of sexual difference when they argue for the intelligibility of trans woman as one form of womanhood. That meaning of gender, they argue, is false and therefore non-scientific but ideological. Hence, they see themselves as gender critical, and as such, okay, this meaning is providing evidence for the state's propaganda to stigmatize feminists. As I have argued early on, drawing on a vast feminist literature of post-structuralist epistemology, discursive practices of meaning-making are ideological in that they maintain the status quo by naturalizing the given hegemonic relations of patriarchal power, the various types of discourses enacted in the definition of feminism reinforce the patriarchal regulation of women's labor and desire precisely by taking gender as sexually pre-given, i.e. by a biologization of sexual difference. The government introduced the rule by decrees declaring a state of danger in March 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then when it was over in May 2022, renewed this rule by decrees at the pretext of war on our borders, referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This mandate immediately opened up the space, imposing 4 acts without debate. They are all contesting the meaning of the category of gender, and through that association with gender, the collectives affected by the law come to figure as a legitimate object for a biopolitical disciplining of the hate rhetoric. The 4 legislative acts over this period of the rule by decrees are as follows. First, the stipulation of gender in April 2020, that should mean biological sex based on primary sex characteristics and chromosomes when recording people's sex at birth in the Hungarian civil registry, and thus make it impossible to change anyone's legally recognized gender in their ID documents. 2. In May 2020, a month later, the parliament voted on a recommendation for the government not to ratify the Istanbul Convention, the first legally binding international instrument for preventing and combating gender-based violence against women. 3, the long-promised bill against child sex offenders in June 2021, but unexpectedly, through a last-minute overnight amendment, it conflames non-heterosexuals with the category of pedophiles. According to the changes, it is prohibited to make pornographic content available to minors, as well as contents that depict sexuality explicitly for its own sake. Most importantly, it outlaws portrayal and promotion of gender identity different from sex assigned at birth, the change of sex and homosexuality in schools and in public service advertisements for persons under 18. Or to put books of this kind on free display in bookstores. 4. Finally, in April 2023, a new law was passed to encourage citizens to report any crime against the so-called Hungarian way of living. There is a public phone line introduced for that. It is defined as behavior that, according to the citizens' understanding, should violate the constitutionally recognized role of marriage and the family, and to ensure authorities to investigate these complaints in order to protect marriage, defined in the Constitution as an institution between one man and one woman, while adding that the mother is a woman, the father is a man. And it is not even called Constitution anymore, because when it was changed and introduced back in April 2011, the genre was renamed as foundational law. So, in the face of such a systemic and forceful hate propaganda by the government, in my opinion, an effective rhetoric of critique should not be pitting reasons against the dominant mode of political communication. Firstly, and above all, because wielding the power to reset the meaning of the terms should count, or whose meaning of a term should count, is unimaginable in the current political situation. But more importantly, ironically, such a discourse strategy would keep us caught within the dominant logic of meaning-making that is mobilized by the rhetoric of hate that invests in reiterating difference as absolute and self-sufficient and obvious. Instead of such universalization and fetishization of difference, we should focus on stepping aside, shifting from the perspective of seeing absolute distinctions structured by binary opposites, and move to a historically contingent act of categorization in relative distinctions organized by plurality. In line with the logic of the intertwined text-context relationship called discourse, we should see categorization as an act of drawing relative, but politically relevant distinctions. This act means underscoring the overlaps, similarities across the different positions that self-identify as opposition. This shift can be made possible by the intimation of the affect of trust instead of hate, where emotions are seen to be acts, where emotions are conceptualized to do things, as Sarah Ahmed in The Cultural Politics of Emotions contends back in 2004. This means that the affect of trust can be seen as a social practice that does not necessarily require absolute sameness. To the contrary, it is to be negotiated out of experiences of discomfort without usurping and transcending the participants' relative difference to the point of some alleged sameness. I am proposing a trust-based solidarity that is seen as the intertwined dynamic of agreeing and disagreeing, acknowledging the indispensability of discomfort for trusting you, because I know I can disagree with you. However, such a community of speech of trust still should have some shared point of departure, even if relative, but it's a condition there. The corollary of underscoring of our similarities would hinge on the agreement that the different positions, the different logics of feminism, should they be queer feminism, trans feminism, radical feminism, or liberal feminism, have hegemonic masculinity, i.e. ideal manhood, as their target in common. And this ideal figure of man, as the four laws indicate, are fought around the entitlements of the white, Christian, upper middle class, urban, cis, heterosexual male patriot. The new element of its gender is its cisness. We feminists cannot afford not to see that the current political struggle to re-traditionalize woman as happily reproducing mother hinges precisely on naturalizing sexual difference at the expense of the visibilization of the possibility of change, either legally or medically. If we continue our debate within feminism along this logic of the epistemological dichotomy of sexual difference, we end up enacting what Lauren Berland back in 1996 in Cruel Optimism has called the spectatorial sports of self-destruction among the already harmed collectives of heterosexual women, lesbian women, non-binary, genderqueer, and trans women in the public sphere, simply making the government's fight against us much, much easier. And that is what we cannot afford. Thank you for your attention. Done. Too long, I'm sorry. I read slow.
Wow, thank you very much. It was really fascinating and thought-provoking. I will open now the floor for questions. If anyone has a question or something they want to say.
Whatever.
What I wanted to ask is I think you spoke about it a bit, but the whole I feel that similar to the situation in Israel, it's a bit of like a recursive loop. That it's very difficult to break because the term like you said, each group has different meanings for similar words. So my question is how, I don't know even how to say this, but how is it possible to break that cycle, in your opinion?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I was desperately trying to include the beginning of the talk, okay, to argue that just because we have a word that sounds like the exact same, okay, it does not mean that they are the same when it comes to what and how they come to mean. And one important strategy by the populist rhetoric of hate, okay, is to collapse these differences into the ideology of the same, I would say, right? And in a way, they need to do that because they try in the first place to empty out established terms, actually like the constitution, right? There is no constitution in Hungary anymore. It is called foundational law. Now, why is it a problem? Not because if you go to not that it exists, but the average citizen, okay, and ask, you know, like, now, what is there in the Hungarian constitution, or what exactly do you think it is, blah, 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 they would be able to answer the question. Nevertheless, there is a kind of network of assumed knowledge, some familiarity, a kind of understanding when you navigate your life as a citizen. And when it is withdrawn, okay, even to the point where the word is deleted, or when you have the same word, okay, but the meaning is turned upside down, okay, then that kind of familiarity is taken away from you. And when this is happening to key concepts at the same time in a systematic way, I would argue the result is, okay, an insecurity and anxiety, right? And this insecurity and anxiety make the citizenry more vulnerable and much more open to a confident, assertive leader figure, okay, who will come along and say, like, look, this is, okay, what these concepts mean, i.e., this is how the world is, this is how we are going to get there, right? That's what I would say, like, as long as you try to expose this logic, the more key concepts you can expose to be emptied out of its usual meanings, okay, or erased completely from the vocabulary, okay, so in that sense, silenced, okay, and you try to explore these events with a focus on the systematic, ideologically motivated changes to the meaning of old political concepts, for instance, okay? That is one possibility, okay, to maintain, okay, this voice of criticism, sort of like outing, exposing, okay, the government strategy. If it works or not, that's another thing. In Hungary, it is very difficult to expect even such a strategy to work, because this past 14 years has always been a space of systematic devaluation and marginalization of thinking. I don't say critical thinking, because thinking by definition is critical anyways, right? So one thing they did within the first 4 years of their ruling between 2010 and 2014 was to introduce new national curricula for the primary and secondary school levels. Like gradually, not like at all levels overnight. They were not that drastic, but like the new batch of students, okay, would be exposed in the first year of primary school to the new national curriculum, right? But this is the first year that at university level, you already have students who have gone through only that new chauvinistic, xenophobic, horrible Christian national curriculum. So it's a very systematic building, actually. And it's very frustrating to see that you don't really see that the few oppositional groupings would understand the importance of how this rhetoric works, or that rhetoric does matter. It's not just sophistry, right? But it builds into the world that then we live on a daily basis, if it helps, if that's what you meant.
Gili?
Thank you, first of all. I have a lot of thoughts, and not all of them are organized, but I did wanted to ask you, first of all, you partly answered it now when you were talking about the institutionalization of this regime, but about underground culture and maybe some discourses of critique that are maybe not silent, but not in the public sphere, or not even contingent, like so this is one question. And another question I wanted to ask you
what about them? What do you ask about them? So you want to know something about these,
I mean, what are they producing?
Voices.
What kind of discourse are they producing? What are they doing to, I mean, there is no way that there are no underground cultures that are trying to contest this. So I wanted to know what is happening, because actually from where we stand, we never get to know about these things. We only get to know what's in the news. So another question I wanted to ask about trust, because you were talking about trust as an emotion or an affect, and I think trust is like it's a bunch of emotions, and you were talking a little bit about vulnerability, and I was wondering how can we work on with trust if it entails vulnerability? I mean, how is this a solution? I don't think I completely understand how can we use vulnerability in such a situation when everything is at stake anyway. So how can we make ourselves even more vulnerable in this way? And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the relation between religion and the nation, because you were talking about it, about both of them as if they were connected in a very obvious kind of way. And I think there are different ways religion and nationality are connected. And I wanted to know about a little bit more about how discourse entails this connection, or how is it done, or maybe undone.
Please, because that's like 3 hard questions.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
Okay, so what I have to say about them, right? Let's put it this way. So first of all, when I was trying to focus on the radical feminist voice within feminism, or in relation to the different feminist voices or discourses or positions, okay, I was bringing in, by talking about feminisms, okay, and then the conflict within feminism, okay, if you wish, about that subversive space, about that marginalized space, okay? That's one thing. At the same time, what I would also like to say is that when you come to a position when an academic degree overnight is declared by the government non-existent, right? And okay, that is in itself an illegal move, okay? But there is no forum where you could turn to contest it. And at the same time, there is no academic community here in the country who would understand that actually this is just a first move for a much broader project, i.e. how to do away with academic autonomy, which eventually happened 3 years ago, 3 years ago, okay, when all public universities, okay, were restructured into this so-called board of trustees, private funds that are performing public services. Now, it is such a structure that I don't have an English term for it. That's why I had to describe it, okay? And it means that you have 5 people, 4 members and 1 chair, all of them appointed by the government, provided the 5 figures fell in line with the prime minister's preferences. So eventually, technically by the prime minister himself. Their appointment is for a lifetime, to make it even nicer. Okay, now in the face of this, if you don't see the majority of the academic world, of the universities protesting, even if there is no legal forum, okay, but like going on strike, refusing to give grades to the students, not administering exams, blah, 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 okay, then it means that this is an inert space, right? That's, so the subversive spaces are there, but they are almost speaking to the void. That's what I'm trying to say. That's one thing. Second, as far as the cultural space in the broadest sense of the term is concerned, has been gongoized by the government, okay, to the point where now we have one central cultural fund, okay, whose director is appointed by the prime minister again. And this guy is in charge of different kinds of funds where you can apply for, okay, including all fields of cultural life. Most recent addition is popular music. So if you want to survive, literally, physically, to get some money in order to be able to produce, okay, then this is your only way to apply for something. At the same time, should there be any non-Hungarian organizations where you turn to and apply, especially if you are like political civil activists, okay? In the third 4 years, from 2018 to 2022, okay, there was the systematic dismantling of those civil organizations as organizations funded by alien vicious money, and they had to name themselves as on their website, okay, where they are obliged to make their budget transparent annually, okay. They had to label themselves as a civil organization sponsored by alien institutions. Cool. Okay, so inert, you are inert on the one hand, and at the same time, okay, this fear campaign that I was also trying to say that at the same time, okay, this fear really expands the anxiety in you, right? So to the point where you really don't you dare to think about anything, okay, because that's the moment of doubt, okay? And then are you going to doubt yourself? Are you going to doubt your own standing? So it's horrible, okay? So there is, and the last moment actually happened at the end of this summer when none of the alternative theater companies, dance companies, music ensembles, you name it. They applied for annual support, which has been ever more meager over the past 4 years, okay? For the first time, automatically, all of them got nothing. They all were turned down. Nobody, but nobody in anywhere in the country, in any field of culture, gets any money from the national budget, from my tax, right? And the whole budget actually in all this has been defined, really, it has come to mean it's the government's money and it is the government's, how should I put it, mercy, okay, and decision whether they think that you deserve some of their money, right? So in other words, the whole thing is really like centrally feeded from the hands of not even the government, okay, because the government itself is terribly hierarchical. So a few people in the government and a few people outside of the government, okay, like really like making the decisions which way to go, therefore, which institutions, which voices to survive and be ordered. That was a long answer to your first question, sorry. As for the trust, okay, and vulnerability, okay. I would say trust is really a dialectical concept, okay? So it is to be worked out of anxieties and vulnerabilities as well. So it is not just I trust you because I know kind of in advance that I agree with you, so we are the same, I don't have to worry about it, but also it's an ability to accept that on all sides that some elements of me will be shared and be in you as well, right? So if I want to get at you, then I will never ever know for sure in advance that I don't get at or aim at something in you that might be damaged in me as well. Okay, so if there is this intertwined relationship, this relative difference understood, then it makes you more understanding, actually more accepting. So you are less willing, okay, that's why I said that it's not a useful strategy to underscore the differences, like I am not like you because I am a different kind of feminist because, okay, so that's why it is more useful to understand what it is that from our different angles we would like to come to an end. And I dare think that it is hegemonic manhood that we all would like to come to an end for different reasons, okay? And also, as a more theoretical answer to that, again by Lauren Berland, okay, so to bring it from affect theory. In her book that is as a collection of essays, and it is entitled The Queen of America Goes to Washington, D.C., okay, or Washington City. I'm not sure which of the two, sorry. In that one, the chapter that bears the same title, okay, she discusses, okay, the moment of, she calls the spectatorial moment of citizenship. And she singles out 3 different historical moments in US history, and the closest to the publication of her work was Anita Hill's challenge, okay, standing up against Thomas Clarence, okay, in those hearings. And in a way, she did not choose that to go public, okay? What she had to say against Clarence Thomas was leaked to the media, okay? But nevertheless, she had to make the decision, okay? And she had to assess the moment, okay? Does she dare to stand up, okay? And speak up, okay? And therefore grab that opportunity or turn that moment into speaking up against the regime, against the dominant logic, right? And it is called spectatorial in the sense that it's a moment, and in a way, in its birth, there is also the fated element of it, but you cannot not do it, right? So that would be my answer. So we can't really calculate, no matter how cleverly we think we are trying. In a way, sometimes you just have to jump. And the third one, the relationship between religion and the state in the production of nationalism. Okay. The most upsetting, most immediate moment as an example for that would be this, I'm sure you have heard about it, the 5th World Congress of the Families. No? The 5th World Congress of Reproductive Demography, sorry. That was in Budapest. And it started back in 2015. And when CEU was still in Budapest, the gender studies students actually organized a massive demonstration with drums and all that against it. Now, there was nothing against it, not just because they are not there, but all these because of all these general tendencies. So anyways, in that, it's the most conservative, most right-wing organization, partly sponsored through the by the Russian government through the Russian Orthodox Church, for instance, okay? And there are studies about these not that visible financial resources behind it. And the Hungarian government is explicitly, openly sponsoring it in the name of its family policies. Okay, again, out of their money, not my tax, out of their money, okay? And in the opening of this event, there was the Hungarian president speaking, there was the Hungarian prime minister addressing the crowd, and in the first line of the distinguished invited guests, there were the 4 representatives of the 4 so-called historical churches of the country, i.e., the Catholic Church, the Calvinist Church, the Lutheran Church, and, I hate to say, a government-sponsored new Jewish church in the name of dividing the Jewish community of those who are religious in the country as well. That guy was sitting there too. And they are literally, on the one hand, bought by the government, and on the other hand, in return, it's not just that they turn up to these important political meetings and grant by their symbolic presence a support for the government's policies, okay? But they have come to the point, and it is particular, actually, very vocally, because they are not doing it in the same way and to the same extent. The Lutheran Church is very reluctant to do this, but if they want to survive, if they want the money, they have to go, they would say. Okay, there we go. The Calvinist Church and the Catholic Church, these are the 2 ones that are very vocally in support of whatever is going on in the country, to the point that they would celebrate masses on the Prime Minister's birthday, to the point that before the elections in the last 3 months coming up to the day, they would be reading out official letters by the clergy of that church about why they should vote for the existing regime, how that would be important for the religious Christian, okay, like in the broadest sense, okay, for a Christian Hungary. Now, what do you expect? But the funny thing is that it is enough if you have only anywhere between 30 to 40% of those who can vote who would say that they are religious, although not necessarily attending the church, regularly observing those regulations, right? So maybe those in the different main churches who would go there on a regular basis, if you take those, it wouldn't be more than at the most 25% of the population. But it's like a critical mass apparently for this propaganda to be heard, and they are very, very anti-trans, like as loud as possible. And that's very, very important now for the government to promote their imaginary family values through a systematic, very loud, very foregrounded anti-trans propaganda. And that they are just there. The biologization of sex, I mean, we know the whole gender ideology discourse on a global scale goes back to the mid-90s, to the Vatican. So, and then it can kind of like unite the different Christian churches around this and against the LGBTQ lobby. Sorry. Did I say something that addresses what you asked?
Yes, thank you for your answers. Really, they're very frustrating, but thank you.
It is very frustrating, yes.
I think that is all the time we have. So I want to thank you again for this very thought-provoking lecture. I think that we all need to process a bit of all the things that you talked about. And again, I just wanted to thank you for coming out and doing this. For me personally, it was very, very important, and I'm really glad we did this.
I would just like to say something, like since you have my email address, right? So I don't know what I inflict upon me, but nevertheless, okay? So if you feel like, okay, contacting me, then just let me know, like, I am so-and-so, I am from that webinar event, blah, blah, blah. And whatever I can say or do, I am more than happy to do that within my own limits. Okay, so.
Thank you.
It.
Yeah, and everyone that doesn't have the email, they can contact me or Gilly, and we would happily share.
Thank you. This is a very generous offer. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention, actually.
Thank you. Have a
Take
great
care
day.
of yourselves.
Bye.
Bye.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.